Hello, this is Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, RCAF USA has been a strong proponent of encouraging the U.S. Department of Agriculture to promulgate rules to implement the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921. Recall, the Packers and Stockyards Act was passed by Congress to protect independent producers against the abusive market power and the anti-competitive conduct of the highly concentrated meat packers. Specifically, the act prohibited the meat packers from engaging in unfair, deceptive, or unjustly discriminatory practices that cause financial harm to independent producers. So let's go back several years. We'll go back to where we had many more feedlots and we had many more packing plants along with more packer buyers. Back then, the packer buyer would come and visit the feedlot and then make an offer for the cattle based on the live weight of the animal. So the producer knew exactly what the price was that he or she was receiving for the animal, and then the meat packer loaded the cattle up on the meat packer's trucks and hauled it to the plant for harvest. Well, soon the meat packers figured out that they would rather buy cattle on a carcass weight basis, and they tried to convince producers that this would reward them for quality. They called this a grade and yield type basis. So as the meat packers became more concentrated and more powerful, they limited the ability of producers to sell on a live weight basis, and in some areas today they only allow the cattle to be sold on a carcass weight basis. So under the carcass weight basis, which we called grade and yield, in fact it became known as grade and steal because of the shenanigans that producers knew were going on within the packing plant. But in any event, the meat packer would make an offer for the animal's carcass weight, and then the producer, the feedlot owner, would have to truck the animal to the plant where it would then be harvested, and then it was the meat packer that would determine the quality of the animal and the price that the producer was to receive. Well, we complained for many years that the meat packers were cheating, and the producer had no way of knowing whether or not the payment was actually accurate because the producer wasn't allowed to stand in the packing plant when the animals were being graded for quality. Well, very recently, in fact last week, we had the U.S. Department of Agriculture entered into a consent decree with the nation's second largest meat packer, Brazilian-owned JBS. And what the USDA found was that JBS was not keeping accurate carcass weights, nor were they keeping records with which to associate a specific carcass to a specific animal owned by a specific feedlot. In other words, the producer was not getting paid necessarily for the animal that he or she actually delivered to the plant. The producer was being cheated. And so the USDA fined JBS $50,000 and entered into a consent decree. And what this example demonstrates clearly is the absolute need for the Department of Agriculture to promulgate these rules so that independent producers can protect themselves from this practice that has been going on for many, many years. It's pervasive within the industry, and yet producers have no ability to correct it unless they rely upon the USDA, as they had done here, and actually found that the violations were so blatant that they finally took some action. And so we have producers who have lost untold amounts of money as a result of the meat packers cheating them when they deliver cattle to the meat packing plant. That has to stop. And that is the subject of RCAF USA's ongoing effort to force the Department of Justice and U.S. Department of Agriculture to finally begin enforcing our antitrust laws and finally begin protecting the independent producer against the abusive marketing practices and the anti-competitive conduct of the meat packers. The meat packers are making windfall profits off the back of the producers, and this has to stop. We now have an example that it is going on. No longer is it just a unproven allegation. Now the USDA knows this practice is going on, and we hope now that they would get to work and write these rules. But remember, it was the Secretary of Agriculture whose trying to protect the interests of the meat packers, because he is the one who withdrew the rules that we had been working on so that we could protect the interests of producers. We need many calls into the Secretary of Agriculture and inform him that it is about time to write rules to implement the 1921 Packers and Stockyards Act. With that, we're out of time. We hope you have a productive week. Thank you and goodbye.